So thank you everyone for joining us today. Good morning and welcome to today's Diversity and Asian Studies event at the George Washington University East Asia National Resource Center, co-sponsored by the Uyghur Studies Initiative and the Taiwan Education and Research Program. Please remember to keep your microphone muted until the end of the talk. There will be time for questions at the end of each of our two speakers' presentations. Just to tell you a little bit about the East Asian National Resource Center, it is supported by the Title VI provision of the 1965 Higher Education Act and is jointly managed by the Sigger Center for Asian Studies and the GW Institute for Korean Studies. Housed at the Elliott School of International Affairs, the NRC enhances George Washington University's ability to engage the broader public community, including students, K-12 educators, minority-serving institutions, policymakers, and the general public on issues of importance in East Asia. Its mission is to provide learning resources on East Asia that empower educators and future leaders to better engage contemporary global issues through events like today's. So today, I'd like to first welcome our first speaker, Professor Henning Klotter, Professor of Modern Chinese Languages and Literatures at the Humboldt University of Berlin, and currently Vice Dean of International Affairs at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. He has previously held positions at the universities of Göttingen, Mainz, Bochum, and Taiwan Normal University. His major publications are Written Taiwanese and The Language of the Sanglis, a Chinese vernacular in missionary documents of the 17th century. His current research is concerned with language planning, multilingualism, and language variation in the Sinophone world. Our second speaker today is Dr. Mirshad Ghalip, a recently graduated PhD in the Department of Anthropology, Indiana University. His dissertation, titled Uyghur Realities, Genocide in the Homeland, Survival in the Diaspora, combines autoethnographic method with qualitative interviews to explore how atrocities taking place in the Uyghur homeland have influenced the language, attitudes, and ideologies of the Uyghur diaspora in North America. Mirshad now works on comparative approaches to language policy and cultural maintenance with a specialization in the language attitude and language maintenance methods of Uyghur diaspora communities around the world. So please join me, everyone, in welcoming Professor Henning Klotter and Dr. Mirshad Ghalip today.
Okay, thank you very much, Lisa, for the invitation and for giving me the chance to share a few of my research findings that I've made over the past years. First, I want to share my screen, my PowerPoint. So just a second. It's like always with Zoom, some things go wrong. So here we are. Yes, the topic of my talk today is audible and visible multilingualism in Taiwan. And my talk is basically divided into two parts. First, I will talk about audible multilingualism, so what you hear, and then I will speak about visible multilingualism, that what you see. At the end of my talk, I will try to give an explanation how these two perspectives interact, how they correlate. But before talking about audible and visible multilingualism, I will say a few words about the language situation in Taiwan in general. So basically, when I talk then about audible multilingualism, it's about language planning and language shift. Language shift, and this is an important result, the reduction of linguistic diversity of Taiwan. And when I talk about visible multilingualism, it's about linguistic landscapes. First, a few remarks on the language situation in Taiwan. Basically, Taiwan is home to a number of Sinitic languages, meaning that they share a common ancestral language. The official language is Mandarin Chinese. Chinese has been the official language since 1945. And then you have two major non-official Sinitic languages, Taiwanese, also known under different names like Taiwanese, Hokkien, or Holo, or Daigi, etc. The naming issue is a very complex and sensitive one. Due to time restriction, I will not say anything about this today. And then you have speakers of Hakka. Hakka speakers mostly live in the northwestern part in the Hsinchu Miaoli area, but you also have a community in the south in Pingdong. So the map on the left-hand side could be a bit misleading because the colors could seem to suggest a distribution or a regional distribution of speakers, which is not really the case. The map should be dimensional because Mandarin is like an overarching language spoken by almost everyone in formal contexts, and the regional languages are spoken mostly in the home domains. And of course, we have Austronesian languages spoken by ethnic groups, most of them living at the east coast and in southeastern and also in northern Taiwan, some of them. It is very important to emphasize that Austronesian languages are all highly threatened with extinction. Only a few speakers are left, and there is currently an interruption of intergenerational language transmission. This is true for Austronesian languages, but also for the non-official Sinitic languages. I've added Japanese in parentheses because it's still spoken as a kind of second first language by the very old generation, and it's also a very popular language among younger Taiwanese who are learning their second or third language. So the fact that Sinitic languages are spoken in Taiwan is due to historical factors. Different waves of migration, and the most important ones took place after the 17th century. In the 17th century, parts of Taiwan were conquered by the Dutch and also by the Spanish, colonized. And after the end of this colonial period, the migration from the mainland to Taiwan started to intensify. Most speakers came from southeastern China, from the Guangzhou and Quanzhou regions, which are still also, until nowadays, the most important dialectal influences of the southern Min speakers in Taiwan. Just to give you a rough impression, if you compare Taiwan in size, for example, to the United States, then it's a little bit bigger than the state of Maryland. When I give the same comparison in Europe, I compare with the Netherlands, which is roughly the same in size. Although it's not a very big place, nonetheless, it's a very complex place in linguistic terms, but also in several other respects. But today it's about the languages. So is there language diversity in Taiwan? How diverse is Taiwan in terms of languages being spoken? Actually, it's mid-range in terms of linguistic diversity. There is in sociolinguistics a notion known as linguistic diversity index, and the underlying idea is that if you go to a certain place, a community, a country, and you randomly pick two speakers, and if there's a 100% chance that each speaks a different language, then the index would be 1.0, which doesn't exist. And if there's a 100% chance that each speaker speaks the same language, then it's 0. So in actual communities, or the language data is, of course, always between 1.0 and 0. The most complex regions in terms of linguistic diversity are in Southeast Asia, Papua New Guinea being on top of this ranking, but also African communities are much more complex than linguistic communities of East Asia. Taiwan in this ranking is ranked on place 103 with a linguistic diversity index of 0.489, which means it's quite complex, but not extremely complex, more complex than, or more diverse in terms of linguistic diversity than Germany or the United States. Of course, these are just rough indications, and these figures need to be taken with caution. They just can give a very rough direction or impression how linguistically complex a certain region is. So in the next section, when I talk about audible multilingualism, I talk about language planning. And I want to present research results, not only by myself, but also various other persons who point out that actually Taiwan has been undergoing a reduction in terms of linguistic diversity, which was mostly caused by language planning, or more precisely, governmental language planning. My approach to language planning relates to the seminal study by Robert Cooper, Language Planning and Social Change, where he distinguishes between three pillars of language planning, so to speak: corpus planning, status planning, and acquisition planning. Corpus planning being about the, so to speak, contents of the language, like standard pronunciation, vocabulary, spelling, etc. Status planning refers to the status of a language in a given society or polity, for example, as a national language, or as a language that is used in state media, administration, etc. And acquisition planning refers to measures that are being taken in order to spread certain languages within a community of speakers, most importantly through education. So, and in this very recommendable study, Cooper asked this question: who plans what, for whom, and how? Giving an answer to each of these WH questions would last very long, so I restrict myself to the who question: who is actually planning? What comes into mind first is, of course, governmental institutions, like here the Ministry of Education of Taiwan, which has played a very important role over the past decades when it comes to the distribution or the promotion of languages on the one hand, most importantly Mandarin, but also to restrictions on language use before the 1990s and 1980s. And I will say a few words about this in a moment. But then in language planning theory and language planning research for many years, there's been a very strong emphasis on governmental institutions and their role in language planning. It's only been in recent years that actually a more diversified perspective has developed, and most importantly, the role of families has been accepted more systematically, or adopted more systematically in research. There has been fascinating research over the last years on family language planning and the questions how families, parents respond to official language policies, whether they are supportive of them, whether they have alternative approaches, etc., etc. So basically, what we can find in a given community is the result or the effects of language planning are the results of two different directions. You have a top-down direction, which is official language planning, measures taken by government institutions who are entitled to take them. And then you have non-official language planning, families just being one example, and bottom-up processes in language planning. And together, these two directions interact, and they produce certain effects, and one effect being a phenomenon known in sociolinguistics as language shift. When it comes to language shift, there is a model, the so-called three-generation model, which is cited very frequently. It was developed by the sociolinguist Joshua Fishman back in the 1970s. The underlying idea is that language shift can occur not always, but often and quite typically within 3 generations. And we are talking here about multilingual societies. For example, you have the situation that the first generation here marked or indicated by the number 1 speaks one particular languages. And then due to the dominance of other languages in the same setting, the next generation, their children grow up as bilinguals, speaking the parents' language at home and the dominant language at school, in the kindergarten, and in public settings. And there's a very high likelihood that their children, generation number 3, will no longer speak the grandparents' language, but only maintains one language, which is the dominant language of the immediate surrounding. So, of course, this may seem a bit simplistic, but it's actually quite applicable to Taiwan and other communities. There are also communities where language shift takes more than 3 generations. And actually, there are also recent studies that it can also happen quicker. So just to give you the impression, so the speakers themselves, of course, they stay, but thing is, through generations, they adopt a different language. So how does this model manifest itself in Taiwan, or how can it be applied to the language situation of Taiwan? Let's look at the year 1945 first, when a 50-year period of Japanese colonization ended. And of course, when it comes to history, you have to rely on historical records in order to assess the language situation. You can no longer do surveys for a period that is 70 years ago. So on the basis of historical accounts, it's extremely safe to assume and claim that Taiwanese and Hakka, the 2 major Sinitic regional languages, were still widely spoken in Taiwan within their respective communities, and that they still had a high degree of linguistic vitality. It needs to be emphasized that Mandarin by 1945 was literally a foreign language to Taiwan. It was not spoken. And we don't find that much information about Austronesian languages, but it is also safe to assume that they were still widely spoken in the respective communities. And it is also known that speakers of Austronesian languages had achieved a certain degree of bilingualism because Japanese was also widely used in these communities. And then historical accounts also point to the fact that Japanese was widely used in formal domains in education. We have to remember that before the beginning of the Japanese colonial period, there was no system of public education. It was really developed by the Japanese colonial government, and the dominant language within public education was Japanese. So there was, according to historical accounts, a new generation of young urban Taiwanese people who were actually quite fluent in Japanese. So this was the situation in 1945. And now let's look at language planning after 1945, when Taiwan became formally a part of the Republic of China. And as a consequence, language policies that were devised in the Republic of China in the 1920s and 30s were also applied to Taiwan. Most importantly, one policy was a strict restriction of the former colonial language Japanese, a policy of de-Japanization, which actually, according to a recent study by Janet Chen, was not very successful at the beginning because Japanese was also still used in formal domains until the 1950s. So it was definitely not the case that Japanese just disappeared. So, but the most important aim of language planning after 1945, when the Kuomintang took over power in Taiwan, was the spread of Mandarin, the standard language of the Republic of China. And especially since the 1960s, the spread of Mandarin was also at the cost of local languages, which were systematically suppressed in education and other formal domains. And the ideological underpinning of these policies was, of course, that from a political perspective, from the perspective of the ruling party, Taiwan was a province of China, and the use of Mandarin as the national language had an important symbolic meaning in terms of identification with the unified Chinese motherland. So the question now, of course, comes up, what were the effects of official language planning, because actually due to restrictions which lasted until the end of martial law in 1987, there were no bottom-up processes. Language planning from the 1950s until the mid-late 1980s was basically quite a rigid top-down approach. And of course, we need to ask what kind of effects such a rigid top-down language planning caused. Here you see some official figures or data collected in Taiwan. The different lines indicate the portion of languages used at home, the home languages, which is a very important indicator. So basically, the blue line standing for Mandarin indicates that Mandarin became increasingly important also as a home language in the period after Japanese colonization. So especially the period of martial law, which lasted from 1947 to 1987. At the same time, Southern Min or Taiwanese, indicated here in green color with a green line, remained quite stable as a home language, around 80%, a little bit more. And I'm still hiding the development after the late 1980s and 90s. I will come back to this part of the development in a moment. So and then in the 1980s, you have a not only in terms of language planning, in several other respects as well, you have fundamental changes in the political agenda of Taiwan. As I mentioned, 1987 marks the end of martial law. It was the beginning of democratization, also democratic competition, free elections, the first free and democratic presidential election taking place in 1996. And aside from the political changes, there was also a strong reorientation towards Taiwan as a reference point, so to speak. The former one China ideology lost legitimization, and there was, ever since, there's been a strong drive towards the recognition of local identities and also local traditions. And for example, in school curricula, since 1990s, you have also courses on Taiwan history, Taiwan geography, which was quite a taboo back in the 1960s and 1970s. And as a part of this ideological turnaround, so to speak, was also one part was the strong support of regional and ethnic languages, but of course also the continued support of Mandarin and also a stronger emphasis on English. So the official language policy went into several directions, and one important direction was and has been ever since the support of regional and ethnic languages through different measures. One measure being, since the late 90s, since the year 2000, also the introduction of mother tongue education at primary schools, although to a quite a limited extent, it's restricted to 1 hour of learning per week, but at least there's some official recognition also of the regional languages. So this, of course, leads to the question whether these measures, which have been taken more systematically under DPP presidents, in 2000, Chen Shui-bian became DPP president, and his government put more emphasis on local language cultivation than previous governments, and also the Tsai Ing-wen government, which came to power in 2016, continued this policy. So the question is, what did this new policy, the recognition of linguistic diversity and accompanying measures, what effects did this policy achieve? Or to quote Fishman again, was there a reverse of language shift? The question, first, another slide. You can also see the new language ideology on several different levels. For example, if you look at the homepage of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the introduction of Taiwan, aside from the national flag and some basic facts and figures, you can also see here the listing of languages. Also that Holo or Taiwanese, Hakka, and Austronesian languages are now officially also recognized as official languages in Taiwan, which is quite a recent development. Here on the left-hand side, you can see a poster announcing a language test for the Taiwanese Minnan language. So there have been various activities in the field of language cultivation. It's like language competitions and examinations, etc., just being some of them. So, but another measure has been the introduction also, or the spread of formerly suppressed languages in media. For example, there's been a Hakka TV station launched in 2003, and 5 years ago, a Taiwanese language television TV station was formally launched with programs only in the respective languages. Which is another indicator also for the formal, for the official cultivation and support of these languages. So, and these policies, as has been pointed out, are actually also the result, not, of course, they have been implemented by the government, but there has been lots of pressure also from local language revivalist groups to promote local languages, to cultivate local languages. And since the 80s, and most importantly since the 90s, there has been actually two-sided effects on language planning, top-down and bottom-up effects. But in terms of effects, actually the measures taken or the measures aiming at the protection of languages other than Mandarin have not been or have not achieved any significant results. For example, if you look at the green line for Southern Min or Taiwanese as the home language, it has been declining, where the blue line for Mandarin has been increasing ever since. And the same is true also for Hakka, which has been been decreasing. There are other recent figures. Different surveys on language use have been done. This study by Chen Shujian is very interesting because it uses the same method as another study done in the late 70s. So it's really helpful when you want to compare data. So these figures are about language use on traditional markets in Hsinchu County. And as you can see here, there has been a significant increase of Mandarin in this semi-private public setting known as traditional markets, whereas in 1978 only 4% of the business transactions on traditional markets were in Mandarin. By 2015, it had risen to more than 50%. And at the same time, the local languages, Taiwanese and Hakka, have decreased quite dramatically. Taiwanese from 91% in 1978 to 44.6% in 2015. And comparable figures have been pointed out by other surveys, also most importantly, also surveys among minors, children, when they, even in regions which are known for traditional use of local language, especially in the South. It has been pointed out that children, when they interact, when they talk to each other, mostly use Mandarin these days. So there's apparently now a very strong language shift still going on towards Mandarin, and an interruption of intergenerational language transmission for several other languages, Sinitic languages, Hakka and Taiwanese, and Austronesian languages. So this is roughly speaking, the development for audible languages being spoken. Now I want to say a few words about also my research on written languages. And whoever travels to Taiwan, to a Taiwanese city, smaller, bigger sized cities, all the same, written languages on public display are ubiquitous. You can see them everywhere. So, for example, this is commercial advertising, but also public announcements, written language on public display, a phenomenon known as linguistic landscapes is extremely widespread in Taiwan, extremely dominant in the urban cityscape. So I'm using the notion of invisible and visible languages when analyzing languages on displays. Quote Langer and Havinger, who write about invisible languages, quote, invisibility describes a linguistic variety or variant that was not written down due to conscious or subconscious stigmatization and hence remains invisible in a literal sense to both contemporary speakers and future readers. Although not relating to linguistic landscapes in Taiwan, it's 100% applicable. So in order to reduce my object of analysis, I'm now focusing only on street name signs, which if you can, a few examples of which you can see here. So a typical street name sign in Taipei City looks like this. And of course, when it comes to visible languages or visible multilingualism, you have different analytical layers than when it comes to spoken languages. What kind of different or aspects can you or do you have to distinguish when you look at something which seems very static, like a street name sign? Of course, you have to look at the name. Then the names are represented in different scripts. Then you can identify different languages on a street name sign and other semiotic features like shape, color, and finally, you have to look where they appear, where a certain street name is used and marked on the sign and where not. So, of course, the example which I show here, the Banka Boulevard in Taipei's Wanhua district, is for several reasons is not a very representative example, but nonetheless, and explain in a moment why this is the case. But first, some representative and 100% standard items are the use of traditional Chinese characters, and each street name sign in Taipei City has a transcription also in the Roman alphabet. So two different scripts are integrated on each sign. Actually, the word Banga comes from a Basai, now an extinct Austronesian languages, originally meaning canoe. But through very complex processes, it has become Mandarinized now in common parlance, known as Mengjia Da Dao, and in the English rendering as Banka Boulevard. But Banga Boulevard, of course, alluding to local culture, also to the culture of the original ethnic groups, is not very representative in the sense that the overwhelming majority of street names and also their representation on the signs is actually fully in accordance still with the traditional one China ideology. You have, for example, many street names like Zhongxiaolu, Loyalty and Filial Piety Road, the Minzu Lu, the People or Nation Road, the Minquan Lu, the People's Power Road, which are terms used in the official state ideology, which is connected to the founder of the Republic of China, Sun Yat-sen. But also place names in mainland China, Beiping Road, even still using the name of the Chinese capital that was used in the Republican area, which is no longer used nowadays on the Chinese mainland, Hangzhou Road, etc. So the overwhelming majority of street names belong to this group, the group reflecting the official ROC state ideology. And also the examples I've just shown in terms of location within the city mark or occupy some interesting spots. For example, the only the English name you find on a street name is the Roosevelt Road, connecting the center to the southern part of the city. but of course in Mandarin, Roosevelt becomes Mandarinized as Losofu. Then the Katagalan Boulevard, which received its name some not even 20 years ago, when some 20 years ago, a bit more, when Chen Shui-bian, the DPP politician, became mayor of Taipei. It was really also a dispute between the pro-Taiwan camp and the pro-One China camp. So a big controversy surrounding this name, but now the name Katagalan Boulevard, named after a now extinct ethnic group, can be regarded as firmly established. Then Zhongshan, another name for the state founder Sun Yat-sen, which is the most important road in northern Taiwan, and the aforementioned Bangka Boulevard, which is located in a district of Taipei City, which is not only associated with traditional temple culture, local culture, but also promoted as such for tourists coming from outside. So other semiotic features are also the direction of writing. Now all the street name signs are read from the left to the right. Not all of them, sorry, that was a mistake, many of them, but you also have the bottom down writing direction. But if you look, for example, back in the 80s, which is not so long ago, you actually still had also right to left arrangements of the characters, and sometimes two different arrangements on for the same on one spot, which is quite interesting at a time when the writing direction had not yet been strictly standardized. So of course the decision, and all these decisions also in some respect also pertain to language planning, are all documented. You can find relevant information about the rules and regulations on the internet, and it has been decided, obviously, also in order to align with international standards, that the writing direction should be from left to right. Also, the colors are quite interesting. There are street name signs in Taipei City are somehow reminiscent of US street name signs, or signs or colors, choice of colors you find in the US. In many European countries, the colors are different. So I haven't found any document relating to this decision, but it is for me more than obvious, of course, then this particular choice of color, which is a recent development actually, can be seen also as an attempt to tie in with international trends and to symbolize internationalization. So back to the languages. What language do you find? I mean, it's very difficult to say whether Mengjia Dadao, is it actually, or Bangka, is it Taiwanese? Is it still the Basai language? This is quite obscure in this in the case of this example. Of course, you have English items like BLVD, dot for boulevard. But the overwhelming majority of street name signs are formally transcribed in Mandarin. For example, here you have the characters, which could be read in Hakka, Taiwanese, etc. But here the transcription underneath makes clear that this is a Mandarin street name sign, and that the official pronunciation associated with this sign is the former one and only standard language. So to wrap this up, and a few final remarks on how these two levels of analysis could integrate or could combine each other. What we clearly have in Taiwan is what Gotha and Thanos refer to as multilingual inequality in public places. There's a huge, enormous discrepancy between the different languages you could hear some 30 or 40 years ago, and the tendency that this becomes Mandarin. But 30 or 40 years ago, it was basically very, street name signage was very dominant in terms of reproduction of official standards, and by contrast, there were various other languages being spoken but not being seen on official signage. You can take actually the street name signs as foretakers of language shift. When street name signs turned Mandarin a few decades ago, Mandarin was not yet so widely spoken. It was street name signs were a visible symbol of a linguistic dominance that had not yet come, which has by now has really arrived in Taiwan. And finally, you can see the street name signs as embodiments of a greater China ideology, which is now being critically questioned and no longer supported by most of the people living in Taiwan, but the visible embodiments are still there. And at the same time, you can see them as embodiments of modernity and orientation towards the West. And what you have definitely on the level of official signage, I'm not talking on non-official commercial signage, that's another story, is the invisibilization, so to speak, of local languages and nativist ideologies, which have become more and more popular ever since the 1990s. And this is where I stop with a final sign, which is not really correct because this picture was taken in Hong Kong and not in Taiwan, but somehow it fits to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks for having me today. So today I will be presenting part of my dissertation research on the Uyghur heritage language maintenance situation in the States. I prepared a PowerPoint file. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So the topic of my talk is Continue Being Uyghur, the role of language ideology and heritage language maintenance. So language attitude and language ideologies, they have been very fascinating to me as a person and as a scholar, as a researcher. Traditionally, this study of heritage language maintenance has been very focusing more on language attitudes. There, as a linguistic anthropologist, which is my background, I've been very fascinated in how or can language ideology play a role in heritage language maintenance, or like I personally felt like it would, so I wanted to do research with the Uyghur population in the U.S. to see it. And so before we jump into the research, let's I just want to give you guys a little bit of background. So as Professor Klotter mentioned many times, cited many times, Fishman is one of the prominent scholars in the field of heritage language maintenance, reverse language shift, and language endangerment, whatever you want to call it, right? So, so he describes this language shift, the process of immigrants in the United States becoming monolingual within a generation of two, or the American experience even. So it is without a question that we can establish the dominance of English in the States. So we have numerous studies, right? So being relatively young or recent immigrants, how do the Uyghurs deal with this challenge, this dominance of English? This is one thing that, you know, that we need to think about. So let's also think about the Uyghur diaspora in the US. So there has been a new study from Uyghur Human Rights Project that confirmed that Uyghurs in the US are, you know, basically around 10,000. But before that, there was no official number. And it was estimated basically by the Uyghur diaspora community that there would be around 10,000 you know, Uyghurs living in the US. And I'm glad we have this, you know, official study and number. So the Uyghur diaspora community in the US are mainly in Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia, or people like to call the DMV area. And they're also in California and the Bay Area. And they're there are also smaller communities across the US. For example, in the Midwest where I'm located, um, there's not a lot of us, but I'd like to think we are a tight community. Whenever um, we we tend to get together from the Midwestern states, we usually can get around 30 or 40 people, um, including children. This is so yeah, not very big. So there's one more context that we need to think about, which is transnational repression. So the researchers have described transnational repression of the Chinese government as a global dimension of the repression that has been taking place since 2016. And they include harassment, surveillance, mobility restriction, physical attacks, or even kidnapping. So it has become very serious. They actually, to go in more in depth into this research, they compared the data before 2016 and after 2016 or 2017, which is when the genocidal campaigns of the Chinese government began. So as we can see, it just drastically ramped up their transnational repression, not only the numbers, but also the severity. And there's another study that also established that the transnational repression also restricts freedom of speech, association or capacity to maintain their culture. And as a person, as a scholar of someone who cares about the Uyghur language in the US, I thought that or not just the US, beyond the US and within the diaspora as well, I thought about this has to be true for language, for the Uyghur language as well. And lo and behold, this was about a month and a half ago, we learned that um, there was a statement in Uyghur actually from one of the mother tongue or Uyghur schools in Australia, which has been running for a couple of decades, I believe, and it's proven by the education department of or approved by the Education Department of Australia. They have been fairly successful. And they put out a statement basically saying that the Uyghurs who were able to visit East Turkestan or Xinjiang Autonomous Region recently they have been harassed by the Chinese police. They've been intimidated because they were conceived to be um, involved in language maintenance efforts in Australia, specifically teaching in the schools. And many of those people who were harassed and intimidated, they never even set foot on their campus. So it is definitely worth thinking about and worth conceptualizing this idea of Uyghur community, home and abroad, as a unit, because we tend to think about them as separate entities or separate groups, but to the Chinese government, they are very much a single group or single unit with their targeting of repression. And I believe that I don't need to provide background on what has been happening since late 2016, 2017 in East Turkestan or Xinjiang Autonomous Region. I'd like to give a disclaimer. I say East Turkestan not because I am politically affiliated or politically supporting a certain ideology or certain group. I say East Turkestan because Xinjiang is a colonial name. And as an indigenous person from that land, I refuse to acknowledge the colonial name. The more we use the term Xinjiang, to me, it more reifies or it basically strengthens the colonial status. I don't want to contribute to that, basically. All right. Other languages in the US and Canada. While Fishman says it's becoming monolingual is a very, very American experience, we can say the same for Canada or many parts of the world where there's colonization and or other kinds of language shift that are occurring. It's not uniquely American, but it is certainly an intense process in North America. So if we look at the Ukrainian language in Canada, they have been fairly successful, actually very successful in their heritage language maintenance efforts throughout their, immigration waves beginning from the 19th century. And yeah, they lived in concentrated areas, maybe sometimes even rural and concentrated areas. And that certainly helped their heritage language maintenance efforts and success. But recently, especially in the beginning of the 21st century, the Ukrainian language has been experiencing a very, very drastic language shift. And the reasons can be attributed to a few different reasons. One of them definitely being language has lost this sense of it being an identity marker, which I will come to later further in depth, or I will compare it with the Uyghur case. But there are other reasons as well. One of them being the Ukrainian population went from more concentrated rural areas into more urban areas. That's also thought of to be one of the reasons why there is a drastic language shift, or Ukrainian Canadians in the 21st century becoming increasingly monolingual. And then the other case that I'd like to draw our attention to, which kind of is a supplement, but also in a way that complements this Canadian case, is the Mandarin Chinese in the US case. The researchers studied, this is more, they did more of an ethnographic field work rather than relying on government census and looking at the big picture. So they found out that, so they basically did their research in Philadelphia with the Chinese diaspora communities there. And they found out even though parents hold a strongly favorable language attitude towards Mandarin Chinese, the children were losing interest in heritage language maintenance as they grow older. The children did not display the same kind of connection between China compared to their parents. And they were annoyed that they had to do this language maintenance. They conceptualized it as language maintenance work as somewhat of an academic task. They were annoyed that outside of school that they're still doing academic work or academic related work. So this is one thing to remember or keep in mind as researchers of language shift or heritage language maintenance. How do we help the children conceive language maintenance as something that is not academic? But anyways, so they found out that the parents had like all kinds of language ideologies about how the Chinese language would give them a sense of Chinese identity. They were also concerned that they will not be able to have a deep conversation, as they call it, as they grow old if they don't speak Chinese. So those eventually led to many conflicts between the children and the parents. And I personally am very curious to see what kind of follow-up research, if there is at all, these researchers will have, what kind of follow-up data will have as the children grow even older or become adults. So let's talk about language ideology and language attitude. So language ideology has been described by a few different scholars. A shared body of common sense notion about the nature of language in the world, sets of belief about language articulated by users as a rationalization or justification of perceived language structure and use. Silverstein is absolutely thinking about language purism in this case, or language structure more like grammar. And the other definition is self-evident ideas and objectives a group holds concerning roles of language in social experience of members as they contribute to the experience of the group. This is also very useful for the WeWork case, but I will be heavily relying on the cultural system of ideas about social and linguistic relationships together with their loading moral and political interests. And this, I want to say it's not, I won't just be relying heavily on Irvine's definition, but it's an amalgamation of all of them. But in my research, in my framework, I tend to lean more towards this one of Irvine's definition. So if we transition to language attitudes, there's this tripartite structure that has been relied on for a couple of decades at least. It sounds archaic in the academic terms, but so far we have not had a better model to study language attitudes. So the first one is cognitive attitude, which is the rationalization of studying a certain language. For example, I was told growing up as an Uyghur kid in East Turkestan, you need to study Chinese because that will give you greater socioeconomic mobility. That's a cognitive process to justify the learning of a language. And affective attitude, very much self-explanatory. A love towards a language, for example, you can say, oh, I love Uyghur poetry or Japanese poetry. That's why I'm studying Japanese or Uyghur. And the other one is behavioral attitude. It's more of a disposition of the previous two and or social environment to sociolinguistic environment to predispose us to speak a certain language. So yeah. So my research, I did a quantitative and qualitative research. So the quantitative research had a survey questionnaire with 50 questions in three different languages, meaning Uyghur, English, Mandarin, Chinese, simplified, since the participants who studied Chinese, presumably majority of them would be from the Chinese education system in East Turkestan or China proper, which uses simplified Chinese. And I had 76 participants, which is surprising to me because because the Uyghur language, like I said, has been a sensitive topic to the Chinese government, and because of that, I've said that we've seen that there is transnational repression just for the affiliation with the Uyghur language of a Uyghur person. So I thought I would be lucky to get 30 participants, but I had 76 nonetheless. It was yeah. Anyways, I hope you get the idea. This was I conceptualized this as an accomplishment in itself. Then I did a qualitative follow-up research with participants who wish to continue. They ranged from semi-structured interviews. They were semi-structured interviews, basically ranging from 40 to 80 minutes each time. I had 4 semi-structured interviews, at least 4 with each participant. And one more thing that I want to mention, because when I was sending the link to my survey, I very much heavily relied on personal connection, because I wanted to keep things on, the low-key side. And I didn't want to attract a lot of attention, because my mother is still in East Turkestan back home. She has not been able to travel outside. The Chinese police or the Chinese security agency refuses to issue her passport to visit me and my sister, who's also in the US. So I wanted to keep things relatively low key and not attract any attention. So I heavily relied on my personal connection to get the links of um, the survey across different communities. I explicitly told everyone that I have given the links to, please share this link with the person that you absolutely trust. Anyways, that's more of the reason for me to be surprised that there are 76 participants, because it was very restricted and limited. So if we look at the quantitative research, this is basically the participant demographics. There's, male, female distribution, born in East Turkestan, born outside of East Turkestan, and Minkaomin, meaning that we were people who went to Uyghur education system, bilingual meaning the bilingual education system, Minkaohan meaning Chinese education, that we were people who went to Chinese education system, and Xinjiang class. If you guys are familiar with Timothy Gross's work, you will know what Xinjiang class is. It's basically selected either academically very well-performing Uyghur and other Turkic kids, and I guess Uyghur and other Turkic children from rural areas of East Turkestan. They were either from middle school or high school sent to China proper to have a complete immersive a Chinese education. It's very similar to the boarding schools of Native Americans. And yeah, there's a fascinating study that has done by Dr. Timothy Groth. You guys can check it out. Anyways, and then there are also people who went through the US education system. There are people with high Uyghur proficiency, fair to poor Uyghur proficiency, and one person who didn't know any Uyghur. And there are also people who say that they're learning Uyghur, they're US citizens, green card holders, asylum seekers, and people who are on a visa. And another disclaimer that I would like to put out is that I relied on self-reporting, especially in terms of I guess everything, but when it matters is that we were proficiency. Um, I could have designed a proficiency test and even went in person and measured their proficiency in terms of speaking and listening. However, I conducted my research during the midst of COVID, and we could not travel because of the lockdowns. So I was relying heavily on self-reporting. Identity and pride. This is one thing that heritage language maintenance researchers or language shift, reverse language shift studies talk about often, is that you got to instill pride and into a sense of identity into the younger generation for them to be more invested in their mother tongue or heritage language. So as we can see, I do apologize. I tried to change the colors because they were very similar, but I managed to change the colors in the charts or here in the bars, but the colors who are defining they weren't changing. No matter what I did. So basically, this is how Uyghur do you feel, and this is how American do you feel, and this is how Chinese do you feel. So if you can follow, a lot of the participants said they feel very strongly in terms of their sense of Uyghur identity. And the interesting thing is like there are more people not feeling they're Chinese than more people feeling that they're Uyghur. And in terms of group identity, it's the same thing with the color. I do apologize again, but this blue is I would like to identify more closely with the Uyghur people, and then this one is I would like to identify more closely with the American people, and then this black with red dot is basically I would like to identify more closely with Chinese people. And as we can see, Uyghur group identity again is very prominent, as also the rejection of Chinese identity. And it's the same here, right, with the colors. And this is, I feel very proud to be Uyghur, 59 people. And while American identity is very neutral in all of them, again, strongly disagree with the Chinese identity or like the pride in Chinese identity. It's even stronger than the pride in their Uyghur identity. So this is a very unfavorable attitude towards Chinese and overwhelmingly favorable attitude towards Uyghur. Is something that we can learn from this chart. And if we look at cognitive attitude, which is one of the three, which is one of the three things in the module that we use to assess language attitude. So I asked, is it how necessary or useful and beneficial to learn Uyghur, learn one of these languages? So obviously Uyghur and English topped the chart or had the highest numbers. And then Chinese had a little bit of cognitive attitude favorability. And then I asked about learning Uyghur for the next generation. We can see, and then I measured it, or we're seeing this according to their educational background, meaning Uyghur educated people who sees it very necessary for the next generation to learn the Uyghur language, and then US educated, bilingual, and then even Minkom, Hans, and Xinjiang class, they're all having this relatively favorable attitude towards learning Uyghur for the next generation. And then if we look at this is basically we're seeing it through the self-reported language proficiency. So if their language proficiency is excellent, if they self-reported my Uyghur is excellent, they're saying it's very, very necessary. And good and fair is also here. And the other, we didn't have a lot of data in terms of necessary, neutral, or unnecessary. So a lot of people do do say it's necessary, but in terms of their language competence, and it is very clear that they say it's very necessary. And I also wanted to see if there is a component of religion in this. And as we can see, people who identify as religious had very strong opinions or attitude towards thinking that Uyghur language is very necessary for the next generation. So affective attitude. So I basically gave them a statement saying that Uyghur has a very high status in the US. So even though it's towards the favorable side, I would say neutral and disfavorable or unfavorable attitudes are creeping in. And for educational background, this is Uyghur educational background, Uyghur education system background, and they are mostly saying that Uyghur does have a high status in the US. And then the people who say Uyghur has a very high status in the US. I also looked at them with language proficiency angle. We can see excellent is again leading the attitude chart. So, and then I also looked at the religiosity, and again, this is similar to the first chart. It's more towards strongly agree, but neutral is creeping in, disagree is there as well. So this might be the place where religion and language proficiency kind of diverges. And then if we look at the behavioral attitudes of the participants, I didn't give you guys the Uyghur chart because they reported they speak Uyghur at home or within their Uyghur social circle, and 90% of them said that. So I just figured that there's no need to look at that chart. But if we look at the chart on English or the graph on English, we can see that it's some people speak it always, some people at work, some people at their social lives, some people at school, some people say outside of home. And if we look at Chinese, people say never, some people say media consumption, some people say social circle, some people say at work. And we can definitely see that this especially English is more so dictated by their sociolinguistic space. And if we look at Chinese, there's also a component of sociolinguistic space as well, but there are a significant number of people who never use Chinese. And then this transitions us to qualitative data, which again, I used semi-structured interviews with 4 participants. Number 1 is a male, 32 years old, who grew up in East Turkestan and went to college in China proper, and has been in the US for about 8 years at the time of the research. And number 2 is a male in his 30s, or he was 30 years old at the time of the research, moved to Japan at a very young age and moved to the US when he was a teenager. And then number 3 is a female. At the time, she was 19 in college. She was born in Japan, but moved to the US at a very young age and basically grew up in the US. And number 4 was a male and 20 years old, also in college, was born in Illinois and grew up in the US. Language ideologies. I'd like to, just emphasize that this qualitative data is more for measuring their language ideologies or learning about their language ideologies. Because with the survey questionnaire, even though some questions can be regarded as, their display of their language ideology, I felt the necessity to really go in. I mean, I'd prefer to have face-to-face interaction and even, like I said earlier, even assess their language competence or affirm their language competence, but I didn't have that chance. So it was video interviews, basically learning about their language ideologies. Number 1 participant displayed a strong language ideology shaped by an existential threat, which has influenced his conception of Uyghur identity. He sees that Uyghur language is a very almost indispensable non-negotiable part of the Uyghur identity, or the identity maker for him. Although he realizes that he lives in the US. People do have the freedom, so it's more for himself and his family. And yeah, number two, coming from more of a cosmopolitan background, moving to Japan at a very young age, moving to the US when he was a teenager. He also, while seeing Uyghur as an identity marker, he emphasizes the benefits of global citizenship and multilingualism. So this is also an interesting language ideology, again, shaped by his cosmopolitan background, right? Number three, um, the only female participant in the qualitative data collection sees Uyghur cultural practices as more of an identity marker than the Uyghur language. So she emphasizes on traditional cultural practices, etiquettes, cuisine, dresses, headwear, and also the socio social structure, for example, like respecting the elders and all kinds of cultural practices as the identity marker, and she sees language as an optional component to her Uyghur identity. I mean, this could be due to her upbringing in the U.S. Even though she was born in Japan, she moved to the U.S. at a very young age, and yeah. Number four had a similar conception compared to number three at the beginning, at least the beginning of his life, let's say, until he was an adult, until everything happened in 2017, he started to think differently. So his language ideology is also shaped by the repression of the Chinese government. So he has begun to see that Uyghur language is an identity marker for him, and speaking Uyghur is a way of continuing being Uyghur. And moreover, he sees that speaking Uyghur as a way to resist the Chinese government's oppression. This was very interesting to see at the time because I got to see him kind of not only rationalizing but shaping his language ideology, not by himself, of course. I just mentioned the external components, and also I might have forgotten to mention in the survey questionnaire, I tried to ask the participants if the genocidal policies since 2017 or late 2016 influenced their language attitude at all. And about half of them reported that it has, and the other half said, I've always seen Uyghur language as an important part of my life. Looked at Uyghur language very favorably, so they said there's no change, but the others said, yes, there is a change, there's a shift. I'm seeing Uyghur language as a more important part of my life. So as we can see, number four participant is experiencing this as I was doing the qualitative research. So this was a very interesting findings for the findings were very interesting to me because as scholars of heritage language maintenance or reverse language shift, we rarely talk about language ideology in a concrete sense, or we rarely sit down and have a discussion with the concept of language ideology. The research that I've mentioned earlier, the Chinese language in the US and Philadelphia, the researchers do talk about language ideology in passing, but they don't go in depth or do anything meaningful with it. So I was very frustrated when I was reading it. And also Fishman, the prominent scholar of our field, he talks about language ideology he discusses the concept of language ideology, but he never says it is language ideology. He mentions that, speakers, heritage language speakers who hold strong beliefs in regards their heritage language or certain behaviors towards their heritage language tend to have more successful heritage language maintenance efforts. But I personally feel like that is language ideology. Of course, I'm paraphrasing him. He talked about it more. When I saw it, I recognized it as language ideology. So with this research, I wanted to bridge this gap, and maybe I'm not bridging the gap. I just if I'm beginning to start a conversation between the two, I would be very happy. Anyways, so back to my study. As we can see, number 4, I can report this, right? I still keep in touch with number 4 participant. He became a fluent Uyghur speaker from a passive speaker when we first started talking, or when our first semi-structured interview took place. He preferred English. Right now, he can code switch between English and Uyghur comfortably and speak to other Uyghurs who with less English proficiency in just Uyghur. So I am very, very happy to report that as an Uyghur scholar who cares about Uyghur language, but also very intrigued as a scholar who wants to study language ideology in heritage language maintenance. And number 1 and 2, they're attempting to raise their children in an Uyghur-speaking household, which is also very much shaped by their language ideologies of Uyghur being an identity marker. And I did not see I should say I keep in touch with number 1, 2, and 4. With number 3, we don't keep in touch as much. Maybe she has become a fluent speaker, maybe not, but so far I cannot tell if she has. So even at the time, her maintenance efforts were pretty minimal. I think this could also be attributed to her language ideology or lack thereof, seeing Uyghur as the identity marker. So yeah, that is basically my talk. I think I went a little short, but the good news is that gives us more time for question and answers, Q&A.